There's an implied promise when you purchased a vehicle. When you purchase a car, there's an implied promise because the person who owns the vehicle and the person who has the money, when the exchange happens, the person who gives the money to the person who owns the vehicle, and then there's the exchange, the person paying the money has an implied promise that the car will run, right? That it'll function. Unless there's, it doesn't run, unless that's told ahead of time, but it's supposed to run. Have you ever bought a car that doesn't run? Have you ever bought a car which has had problems? I'm afraid I'm part of that group, okay? We bought a Dodge Caravan. You will notice if you look at the stock of the McClain cars, we now own 3 Toyotas. But once upon a time, we owned a Dodge Caravan, and I must say that the Dodge Caravan drove a little bit like a sports car. I was very impressed. I liked where the buttons were at and the lights were at. I liked the way it drove when it drove. The difficulty is that the Dodge Caravan was one which had problems almost immediately. I think we were under 1,000 miles before we had the first failure. We had purchased it, and I remember I was driving from Spokane by myself. I'm not sure why I was by myself, but I was driving from Spokane. I was coming back to Western Washington. I was driving late at night. I was on the way up Snoqualmie Pass. I was almost up there, and I began to hear I am not a mechanic, but I know that is not a good sound. And I thought, oh my goodness, maybe I have a flat tire. So I was all the way at the very top of Snoqualmie, and I pulled off, and I got there, and I went outside, and I looked at all my tires. They're all good. Well, take off the simple stuff. So then I popped the hood as if I knew what I was doing, right? I popped the hood, and I got a flashlight, and I looked in there, and I don't know anything. But there it was. God mercifully allowed the serpentine belt to show itself and its defect right there, right in front of my face. This van had a serpentine belt, went through all these little, pulleys and gadgets and things like this. Gadgets, technical term. And there it was, this very thick belt, and I could see that a piece about this long began to strip off of the main belt. And I said, oh my. Okay, I know what's wrong. That's hitting the not the roof, the hood. Thank you. Not a mechanic. Not a mechanic. Yes, the hood. Yeah, it was hitting the hood. So I said, okay, so what are you going to do? Because it's almost midnight, so I've got to get home. And I can't sleep here. So I said, well, I pulled out my pocket knife and I cut it off. So I did. So I said, well, I'm a man of faith, so I'll pray. So I got in my van, and I said, Lord, get me to North Bend. 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 And I got to North Bend. And I said, Lord, if you can get me to North Bend, you can get me to North Seattle. You can get me to North Seattle. It's true. It's true. And so I got there. I got home, and I took it to the dealership, and they said, oh, yeah, it's a problem. They changed out the tensioners and the pulleys and the serpentine belt, and they said, oh, yeah, no problem. But the problem didn't end there. Over and over and over again, this serpentine belt would come off, and always at the worst times. Always at the worst times. Snoqualmie in a rainstorm. We went to Teen Leadership Conference. If you've ever been there, it's outside of Antelope, Oregon, which, by the way, is Nowheresville. In the middle of a snowstorm with a bunch of kids in the back, and what happens? Comes off. We sat there for a couple of hours. A tow truck driver came by, and he said, oh, and he was able to slide it back on, and we got on our way. But otherwise, we would be still there today. My wife was pregnant with child number 4. She was taking Thad to his basketball game. So we have Thad at the basketball game. Nate's going. Joseph's going. We got Thad's his little friend. So she's got 4 boys plus 1 in the oven. So there she is, and she's just outside of Richland, and it slides off. She gets out, pregnant woman gets out, and she begins to walk down the side of the highway with 4 little kids walking down the highway. Always at a bad time. Always at a bad time. The only good part about this was what the little friend of Thad's was also the son of our mechanic. So we got a free tow out of that one. The day after Christmas, coming from Spokane at my parents' house, coming back down to the Tri-Cities area, Rainstorm outside of Connell, belt falls off. That's right. One more time. At this time, Elise says, go salad, salad, salad. You say, it fell off in Connell, by the way. And you say, where's Connell? Connell is in the middle of, well, it's not nowhere, but you can see it from there. Anyway, there's an implied promise. There's an implied promise that when you purchase a vehicle, that the vehicle will run, correct? It is, right? Okay. You trust that it's going to hold up to its obligations. If somebody's promising you something, it must come about, right? And if they can't hold up, honestly, their promise is no good. Our Dodge Caravan was a lemon. This morning, we're going to come back to the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 6. We'll begin looking at verses 13 through 20. And as we do so, we are going to look at the one who can keep his promise. It's not simply an implied promise, it is a stated promise, and it is a promise which God has the ability to maintain. You see, our God is one who gives his word, and his word is ironclad. Our God is not in the business of selling lemons. Our God is in the business, if you will, of speaking truth and only truth, and he has the power to carry through. Let's come then to Hebrews chapter 6. Hebrews chapter 6, we came through a very difficult section. Hebrews chapter 6, we looked last week at verses 4 through 12. Now as we come into verses 13 through 20, it's a little bit of a happier section, if you will. 4 through 12 is difficult. It's challenging. I think we have a good understanding of it. But now as we come into 13 through 20, we see it here a little bit of a happier face of a passage. Look at 6:13 and let us read. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. Now this isn't the easiest passage to break down, so we're going to start here not with God, but we're going to look at the one who believes the promise of God. We're going to look at Abraham. Now, if you've been going through the book of Hebrews with me, you may be asking, why in the world are we talking about Abraham all of a sudden? I mean, Abraham was mentioned sort of as an offhand comment in the second chapter, but all of a sudden we have Abraham, and all of a sudden he's a main character. He hasn't been mentioned in chapter 6 yet, or chapter 5, or 4, or 3. So why is Abraham brought up? Well, I want you to go back one verse from last week, and this is why. If we go back up into 5:12, so that you may not be sluggish or dull, but imitators or mimics of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. And so what he's doing here, he is telling the people, he's telling the audience, he's saying, I don't want you to be sluggish, I don't want you to be dull, I want you to be imitators of those who had patience and those who had faith. Oh, and by the way, if you wanted to look at somebody who has patience and somebody who has faith, boy, do I have an example for you. And his name is Abraham. This is why, as we come into the 13th verse, all of a sudden we have all kinds of talk about Abraham. So look at the 13th verse again. So when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater to swear by, he swore by himself. And then down in 15, and thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. Abraham is a great example of patience. Think about the life of Abraham. Think about all that he had to go through. You go to Genesis chapter 12, and Abraham is called from the Ur of the Chaldees. And God says, come on out. I've got a place for you. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to make you a great people. And Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. So we see this great declaration by God in the 12th chapter of Genesis. And we are told that Abraham is 75 years old. And then he waits, and he waits, and he waits, and he waits. Do you know that we have to wait until the 21st chapter? The 21st chapter, that's a long ways. That's a lot of reading. We have to wait to the 21st chapter, and Abraham is 100 years old. 25 years. And only then is Isaac born. We see that the patience of Abraham is not a perfect patience. We see that both Abraham and Sarah get a little bit tired of waiting upon God. There are times where they decide, you know what, we're going to figure things out our own way. If you go to the 15th chapter, we see that Abraham basically has given up upon the idea that they're going to have a child. And he says, well, Eliezer, my trusted servant, he's going to be my heir. Lord, let that be the case. And God says, no. One who comes from you will be your heir. A little bit later on, Sarah says, well, this is silly. We've been waiting way too long. So, you know what? I'm well beyond my childbearing years, Sarah says. Sarah's 10 years the junior to Abraham. At the time that she has Isaac, eventually she'll be 90 years old. She says, I'm beyond childbearing years. I'm not having any more kids. Well, I haven't had a kid and I'm not going to have one. You know what? I've got a deal here. We've got my servant girl over here. Go ahead and have it her and have a child by her, and we'll declare that child the heir. And God says, no, that's not how it's going to work. Nope. They have patience. It's not a perfect patience, but it is a patience. It is interesting, though, when we look at this passage here, it's not Genesis 12 and it's not Genesis 21, which is referenced. It's Genesis chapter 22, which is referenced. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a quotation from Genesis chapter 22. And it's a quotation from Genesis chapter 22 after God tells Abraham to do something which is extraordinarily difficult. In Genesis chapter 22, Abraham is 100 plus years old. We don't know exactly how old he is. We know that he is going to take his son Isaac with him. We are told that Abraham will put the wood upon Isaac, that Isaac will have to carry the wood. I'm thinking that he's at least 13 years old, probably a young teenager, maybe an older teenager, maybe a young man, but we're not positive. Not a child, I don't think. And therefore, Abraham is, let's say, 115 years old, just to pick a date or pick an age. And God tells Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, take your son and you offer him as a sacrifice at the place which I show you. And if you read Genesis chapter 22, we see that Abraham gets up early in the morning, he packs his things, and they go. Let me tell you something. I have 4 boys, but I don't think I could spare one of them very easily. Well, maybe one. Only kidding. I think I would have a bit of a discussion with God. God, what are you talking about? What about Isaac? Because he's the one that you gave to me. He's the son of promise. He's the one from whom we have multiple generations are supposed to come through him. So why in the world are you telling me to take him up, to kill him, and to burn him on an altar? That doesn't make any sense, God. But here's the weird thing about Genesis chapter 22. Abraham doesn't argue with God. He gets up early, he packs his stuff, and they head off on a journey. If you go to Genesis chapter 18, when God says, I'm about ready to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham argues. He says, oh God, you don't want to wipe out a whole city just because, what if there's 50 people? Or what if there's 45 people? What if there's 40? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? And we see this ongoing negotiation which Abraham has with God. But when Abraham is told by God, go and sacrifice your son, there is no argumentation. There's only obedience. Would you have such obedience? Would you have such faith? I find it mind-blowing. We get a hint, though. We get a hint of the mindset of Abraham and why he can move forward with faith. We'll scoot ahead. We'll steal some thunder from a sermon in the future. But Hebrews chapter 11, look at verse 17. By faith, when Abraham was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. Now, his only son of promise. Obviously, Ishmael was his son as well. That's what that means. Of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. I mean, you've got Isaac there, and he's on top of the altar, and the wood's there. He's got his son, and he's grabbed him by the jaw, and he's pulled his neck backwards. He's taken the knife, and he's about ready to slit his throat to spill his blood, isn't he? He's reached for the knife. Abraham, don't go there. And it's at this point that we get the quotation. So let's go there. Genesis chapter 22. Verse 15, and the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, as the sands that are on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gates of his enemy. In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. This is what's being referenced here. If you want to look at an example of faith, and this is what our author of Hebrews is doing, he wants to give the people that he's writing to, a people who have been going through quite a bit of difficulty, he wants to give them an example of faith. Here it is. Here it is. The reason that Abraham can trust God is because he understands that God is not a used car salesman. He understands God's promises because God has made his promise and God has been true all the way through. He is the father of a son that came from his body, that came from his wife, even though they were, in one passage, it's described as good as dead. But there it is. God has been faithful all the way through, and now by the time you get to 22, God says, I will do this because God told me to. I will believe. So we come back to the 13th verse here, focusing now upon the promise of God rather than upon Abraham. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. I'm going to do this. We see that Abraham believes, verse 15, I misread. Saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. You know, God swears, and he swears by himself. Do you remember when you were in elementary school when people were having to make promises? I don't think people do this as adults. I hope you don't. Where people would say, I swear to God, or I swear upon my mother's grave, or I swear upon the memory of my mother's grave, or I swear not upon a Bible, but I swear upon a stack of Bibles, right? And why do people do this? They're doing this because they're trying to borrow the credibility of somebody or something else, right? I'm borrowing the credibility of the Bible. Well, not just the Bible, but a whole stack of Bibles, right? And God doesn't have to say, well, I have to go ahead and defer, or I have to reference somebody else and to swear by their name. I don't need to borrow any credibility because the credibility I have is my own. I don't have to borrow from anybody else's credibility. I am credible. I have promised it, and it's going to happen. But what's interesting here is that God not only is going to promise, and he does promise Abraham, but not only is he going to promise, but he is now going to give an oath to secure even more so it. It's fascinating to me that we're going to see this almost an overabundance of a surety which is given in this passage. God is going to swear by himself. In Genesis 22:16, we already saw that God swears by himself. In Exodus chapter 32 and verse 13, we see here as Moses is writing, he's talking about how God swears by himself. If you turn to Isaiah, which I think this is kind of an interesting one, Isaiah chapter 45. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 22, we again see the same wording where God is swearing by himself. 45, we'll pick it up in 22 and then do 23 as well. Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. By myself I have sworn. From my mouth has gone out in righteousness a word that shall not return. To me every knee shall bow and every tongue shall swear allegiance. I swear it. I think it's interesting, though, at this particular point here, because the wording here in Isaiah 45:23, it's the same wording which you see in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 10, where every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Christ is Lord. I think that's interesting. Here we have a God who is saying, I promise, and not only do I promise, but I give an oath to my promise. It is a doubling down. Abraham, I have made a promise, now I'm giving an oath. It is not going to go away. Now again, let us remember the overall context of the 6th chapter. In the 6th chapter, what we have been studying, we've seen here, in the early part of the chapter, we have people who appear to be believers. They may have been identified with the church. They may have been baptized. People might have said, oh, that person looks like a Christian. But it seems that either they're self-deceived, and at this point they have walked away. They have walked away. And some might say, well, maybe God's promises aren't worth their weight. To which our author wants to assure them very, very strongly, that's not the issue here. The issue is not God's promises. The issue is not with God, but it's with those who walked away. We come then back to Hebrews 6, and we'll look here now at verses 16 through 20. For people swear by themselves greater than themselves in all their disputes. An oath is final for confirmation. Once again, God swears by himself. There's no other greater authority which he has to come back to. But then in verse 17, so when God desires to show more convincingly to the heirs of promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. So as we look here, we have all of these words on foundations, on solidness, on the strength of God's promises as we come verses 17, 18, 19, and 20. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise, who are the heirs of the promise is my question. Is he speaking just of Abraham again, or is he speaking of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and that type of thing? I don't believe so. I think we should take a look at this heirs of the promise and go right back up to 5:12. Because at 5:12, so that you may not be sluggish or dull, but imitators or mimics of those through faith and patience inherit the promises. He is telling the audience of the Hebrew audience, he is telling them, I want you to be a people who have a faith like Abraham. And so now as he has given promises to the church, he's saying, I want you to live with full confidence that whatever he has promised you, the church, he will fulfill. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. Now again, look at all of these words which we have here dealing with assurity, or with surety. He talks about God's promise. It is the unchangeable character of God. It doesn't morph. It doesn't metastasize. It doesn't change. He says it's the unchangeable character of his purpose. If you go down into verse 18, so that by two unchangeable things, once again we see that same wording. Look at some of the other wording. The unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed. He guaranteed it. How did he guarantee it? With an oath. So you have a promise that is a guarantee which is backed up by an oath. It seems like he's being kind of serious here. Verse 18, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible, so two unchangeable things, that there's a promise and then there's an oath. So there are two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie. Once again, he wants to point out the fact that God cannot be snookered. God cannot lie. God cannot deceive. We have a God who we can trust. It is impossible for God to lie. We have fled for refuge. We who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. You know, these are people who have gone through a lot. These are people who have suffered. We are told in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 4 that they have not suffered to the point of shedding blood, but it's very possible that they've had their things stolen from them, that they have had to literally flee for their lives at times. If you go to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 32, but recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with suffering, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. These are people who have already gone through significant difficulty. And the temptation that they have now is that they've suffered a little bit, but maybe that's just enough. Maybe it's time to turn. And our author is saying, no. God has promised. God has promised. God has sworn an oath over his promise. God cannot lie. It is out of his character. He cannot do it. God cannot change. You must hold on to him. You must. Hold tight to him. You know, if God is not God, if God were not able to keep his promises, then we have no surety. But God keeps his promises. This is not to say that we may not suffer. You may die for your faith, but we worship a God of resurrection. And we know when all is said and done, we are good with him. It is impossible for God to lie. We who have fled for refuge might have a strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us, to hold fast, to grab hold of it, to not let go. It is set before us. You know, I know some of you guys study martial arts out there. Okay? My wife? No, not so much. I remember when we were kids, we were always wrestling, you know. You'd be out in the front yard and you'd be wrestling and that type of stuff. And I remember that, you'd grab somebody and hold on to them and you'd hold them like this, And you thought that was a strong maneuver. That, you're not going to break that. And I remember people say, oh, no. Somebody learned it probably in gym class or something like that. That's not a good hold. And I said, really? They said, make it like a hook and like another hook and do this. And it's much stronger. It's true, by the way. You can try it. That's free, by the way. And I'm like, wow, that's really cool, because you can hold it tighter. It's harder to break. It's harder grip to break. And some of you have studied these type of things. You know all better things than that, but that's what it was. And he's saying here, I want you to hold on tight. I want you to hold on tight because you need to hold on the God who will keep his promises. This idea, this temptation that you'd walk away, nonsense. You have a God who does not change. You have a God who does not lie. You have a God who gives promises, and you have a God who backs up his promises with an oath. Are you kidding me? Why would you walk away from him? And they feel that temptation, but he's saying, let me encourage you. Hold on strongly. Again, we have so much more of the wording which talks about of strength in here. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. Let's stop there. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor. I like the word sure here. I was looking up, I was reading, do you know what the word sure here is an adjective, but the A noun associated with this is asphaltus. You're like, oh, I think I kind of recognize that word. Congratulations, you know some Greek. Asphalt. We get the word asphalt from this word. It's the word sure. You know, the idea, it's something that's compact, it's hard, it's something that you can rely upon. Unless you go to downtown Tacoma where they carpet bomb the asphalt. But, you know, leave that aside. The imagery is one of strength, of something which you can't move. And if that's not enough, he adds another one to it. He says, have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. Look at all of these words about strength and surety which are there. It's asphalt tough, it is steadfast, and it is an anchor for the soul. Isn't that awesome? I mean, you get these big giant cruise ships, and you drop anchor, and that anchor, when it grabs its purchase, it does not let go, and that ship's going to stay where it's at. The anchor of your soul is the Lord. What are you thinking? Don't cut the ropes. Don't cut the chains. Hold on to him. A hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. A hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, obviously. This is temple talk. The idea of Christ as our personification of hope, if you will, enters in behind the curtain. He is the one who will intercede for us, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And what we see here is we have this idea where beforehand there was the separation because of the curtain between the Holy of Holies, and now we have Christ who has entered in and he intercedes. It reminds us, of course, of chapter 4 and verse 16. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We can come to the throne of grace. We have access to it. Christ, our hope, is our forerunner. He has gone forth. He has gone before. The idea as we look at this section here is kind of this. You could almost, in my Bible it says the certainty of God's promise. Okay, that's what the ESV has as their title for this paragraph. It's a pretty good title. You could also put it in a negative sense, the craziness of trying to get away. Why in the world would you do that? Everything about this passage talks about strength and surety and how God's promises last. Listen. You're in a world which will have lots of challenges. Because of your stance for Jesus Christ, you may lose your job. Because of your stance for Jesus Christ, you may lose your fortune. Your retirement account that you have been building up since you were 20 years old may get wiped away. Your reputation may be besmirched. You may end up in a cell someplace because you dared say something which was not politically correct in this world. We see it in other places in this world. It's coming. So what's the answer? Go find a place to hide? I don't think that's the answer. Matter of fact, what we saw already in the 5th chapter was, hey, some of you have become dull. Some of you have become... You've become weak. You should have been teachers. You should have been telling other people things, but you decided, to sort of back off a little bit, maybe get along with the crowd a little bit better. And the problem is that there's a danger in dullness because when we continue to go ahead and say, well, I won't stand up, it causes doubt. It causes an existential difficulty within us. We see that there is a discontinuity in how we're supposed to act and what we say we believe. The answer is to continue to stay strong. And don't let the bullies of this world bully you. Doesn't mean you're trying to be some sort of jerk Christian. It means you are standing up for Jesus Christ and you're saying, this is the God which I serve. Because he has promised, he has sworn with an oath, he cannot lie. My sure foundation is him. He is the anchor of my soul. He is the one who intercedes for me. I can trust him. As Abraham believed so much that he was willing even to sacrifice his one and only son of promise, I'll stay with Jesus. That's what you have here. As I was going through this, I was thinking of a song that came to mind, and I think this song came to mind because almost surely the hymn writer, and forgive me, I didn't get the name of the hymn writer. Almost surely the hymn writer was reflecting upon this section of Scripture, or at least a portion of this section of Scripture, as they wrote a particular hymn. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ, the solid rock, I stand. All of the ground is sinking sand. All of the ground is sinking sand. When darkness hides his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. Trust in you and only you, his oath, his covenant, his blood, support me in the overwhelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is my hope and stay. On Christ, the solid rock, I stand. The sure footing, the asphalt. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. I exhort you, stay with him. Stay with Christ. He's it. He's it. He is worth all that you have, every bit of faith that you have. Everything else is false promises, but Christ is true. Our God does not lie. He promises and backs it with an oath. Amen.